Hello, everyone, and welcome to another How to Get Published webinar. We are going to start in a few minutes. We are just going to wait for people to join. Just a few more seconds. All right, I think we are going to start now. So thank you again for joining us today for this webinar on authorship, etiquette, and collaboration. I am going to introduce our team of speakers for today. So I'll start with Jessica Offenberger, who is a publishing editor on the Sage Journal's editorial team. She works closely with editors and societies to help navigate the publishing process and develop key strategies. Next, we have Adia Misra, who is an experienced publishing professional with expertise in publication ethics and clinical research. Adia has worked in a senior editorial roles, bringing together subject-level expertise in molecular biology, medicine, and public health, along with hands-on experience in publication ethics, research integrity principles. Adia has a broad interest in evidence-based research, science communication, and research integrity, all of which have developed via initiatives at various employers and in her previous life as an academic researcher. Next, we have Michael S. Matthews, PhD, who is a professor and graduate program director at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He recently completed a 5-year term as co-editor of Gifted Child Quarterly and previously was a co-editor of the Journal of Advanced Academics. He has served in various leadership roles, including as chair of the SIG Research on Giftedness, Creativity, and Talent of the American Educational Research Association, and on the boards of several local, state, and national organizations related to gifted education. His research addresses equity in assessment and identification of gifted children, education policy, motivation and underachievement, and parenting, including homeschooling of gifted learners. Dr. Matthews' scholarship also focuses on gifted and academically advanced learners who are English learners. He is author or editor of 6 books, over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, and numerous book chapters. His work has been recognized with the AERA's Michael Pirrett Collaboration Award, the 2020 Distinguished Service Award from the North Carolina Association for the Gifted and Talented, and Best Scholarly Books from the Texas Association for the Gifted and Talented. And finally, there's me, Maria Tissot. I am marketing manager in the author marketing team at Sage, and my work is focused on helping early career researchers get published. You can send us your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on your screen. You should see it at the bottom of your screen, and we will have around 20 minutes at the end of the session to answer them. And if we don't have time to answer all questions, do not worry, we will follow up with you after the webinar. So now I'm going to pass it on to Jessica to start the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Maria, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're really excited to cover authorship and all that that entails. So without further ado, let's focus first on what constitutes authorship. So authorship confers credit and has an important academic, social, and financial implications. Authorship also implies responsibility and accountability for published work. So it is important to understand what counts as an author. Anyone who can claim legitimate authorship, claimed authorship, means that they have done all of the following listed on this PowerPoint slide. So they would have made a substantial contribution to the concept or design of the work, or in the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data. They would have helped draft the article or revised it critically for important intellectual content. They would have agreed with and approved the version to be published, and participated sufficiently in the work to take that public responsibility for appropriate portions of the content. This criteria applies to all article types. So when there's no acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work for an editorial, for instance, the first criterion may be met by the conception or design of the work. So all others should be listed in the acknowledgement section. So yes, you do need to meet all 4 criteria listed here to claim authorship. If a large multi-center group has conducted the work, the group should identify the individuals willing to accept direct responsibility for the manuscript, and those individuals within that large multi-center group should meet the criteria for authorship. When submitting a manuscript authored by a group, the corresponding author should specify the group name if one exists, and then clearly identify the group members who can take credit and responsibility for the work as authors. So the byline of the article identifies who is directly responsible for the manuscript, and then Medline will list those authors, whichever names appear in that byline. So if the byline includes that group name, one of the common questions we get is how will PubMed or Medline or PubMed Central list this? So Medline will list the names of individual group members who are authors or who are contributors or collaborators, maybe called non-author contributors. If there is a note with the associated with the byline clearly stating that the individual names are elsewhere in the paper and whether those names are authors or collaborators. So that's a lot of information there. For authors submitting specifically to social sciences and humanities journals, all parties who have made a substantive contribution to the article should be listed as authors. And principal authorship, author order, and other publication credits should be based on the relative scientific or professional contributions of the individuals involved, regardless of their status. I know our panelists will be speaking to author order later today, so we'll go forward there. This is a lot of information and criteria to think about. So there's a few different resources that you can use to determine authorship here. Many journals base their authorship criteria on the ICMJE's authorship guidelines. All of these are hyperlinked, so when we post the slides, you'll be able to click through these resources. But some styles like APA have guidance on this as well. We recommend using forms to help guide and determine when someone can meet that authorship criteria. APA has a form that you can use to fill this out. Credit the contributor roles taxonomy. This is really helpful for those larger teams and projects, multi-center groups and organizations that we talked about on the previous slide. And then COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. They have a vast number of resources offering guidance on authorship for you to take a look at. So one common question we often get is around single author publications and whether there's a bias in this. So the short answer is no. Editors do not and should not have a bias against single author publications. But that being said, there's definitely certain factors when evaluating a paper as a whole on authors and in particular single author publications. So editors may consider the author's expertise and credibility in the field. A single author publication can be viewed more favorably if the author is well known and respected in the field and has demonstrated a high level of expertise in the topic being discussed. But it's focused not on prestige, but on the subject matter and the expertise at hand. So the authors may also consider the editors, may also consider the originality and significance of the work. So thinking back to our previous webinars on how to select the right journal, thinking about the right home for your manuscript. We talk about the originality and significance of the work that's being produced. So a paper might be more highly valued if it presents a unique perspective or makes a significant contribution to the field. And this could also include new research findings, innovative ideas, or a fresh approach to a new topic, or even a well-studied topic. So last but not least, editors are also looking at the quality of the writing and the presentation. So thinking about a well-written, clear, and well-organized manuscript and study to effectively communicate the author's contribution to their work and field, and thinking about that intended audience. So whether it's a single author publication or a larger group, it's focusing on the expertise, the credibility, the originality of the research, significance, the quality of the manuscript, not solely on the number of authors. I'm going to pause here, and Michael, I wanted to see if you have any tips from an editor perspective that you want to share with us.
Sure. So yeah. So as you said, there's not really a bias against single author publications, but that said, it tends to be people who have been in the field longer, who have the expertise to be able to write something that represents a substantive contribution and to do it all by themselves, as opposed to as a member of a larger team of authors. And so I think that's the main thing to think about is, are you able to say something that's new enough and breaks new ground in a way that it will intrigue the journal's readers? Can you do that by yourself as an author yet? And if you can, feel free to try, and we'd love to see it as editors. But it does tend to take people that have more expertise and more years accumulated in the field to be able to make those kinds of original, groundbreaking contributions on their own.
Thank you. And I know we'll talk more about this on collaboration and how to get involved, but one of the other common questions we get is, how can you get your work published when you're thinking about maybe renowned researchers that you might be competing against or even want to collaborate with? So you can think about publishing in a niche area. So instead of trying to compete with renowned researchers in a highly competitive area, try to find a niche area that has not been explored as much. And this will help you potentially stand out and make a significant contribution to the field. You can focus on originality. That's definitely something that will help you stand out, coming up with new research questions or approaches that have not been explored before. So thinking about that originality of the research. I know Michael will be talking about this, but collaborating with others, this is absolutely a great way to increase your visibility and credibility in the field. So looking for opportunities to collaborate with other researchers, especially those that are well respected in the field. You can do this by attending workshops and conferences. This can help you stay up to date on the latest trends and research in your field, but as well give you the opportunity to connect and network with these researchers and build those collaborations. Focusing on the writing, we have some great webinar recordings already available on how to write your manuscript. And we've got a great one coming up this July on additional guidance that's available to you. But that solid writing, that good writing, is essential to getting your research published. So making sure it's well written, clear, and concise. You can seek feedbacks from your colleagues and professional editors to help improve the quality of your writing. And be persistent. Sorry, Michael, would you like to chime in? I mean,
Sure.
you have great expertise and insight.
Sure. Well, I'll just chime in and say that one of the keys to getting published is knowing the different journals that are in your field and having an idea of whether, for example, one journal might prefer articles on a specific set of topics or specific methods, approaches, or one journal may be considered more prestigious than others and therefore harder to get published in than a different journal might be. Or some journals, their editors, for example, are maybe more committed to helping early career scholars to refine their manuscripts and therefore maybe more likely to help you revise through multiple revisions to get published, whereas a higher tier journal might just say, no, this isn't ready for this journal yet. Let's reject it right now. So generally, if your work is solid and doesn't have fatal flaws, there is somewhere that it'll be publishable. There is a journal that will publish it. And part of your job as the author is to know the journals in your field well enough to know which one is likely to be the best one that you can get your work published in for a given piece of work.
Absolutely. And your co-authors, your peers, your colleagues, the people that you meet at conferences and workshops will be able to help provide that insight for you if you're not quite sure where to start. And I encourage you to go back on to our webinar on how to select a journal that's got a great foundation on where you can start there. But remembering, as we're talking about authorship and collaboration, it's not necessarily to compete with renowned researchers. It's to make a meaningful contribution to your field and to your study. So by focusing on that originality, collaboration, and being persistent, you can really increase your chances of getting published and making a name for yourself in the field.
And one more thing I'll add real quick to that is the other thing to be aware of is if you're working in a job in academia, think about where does your institution and your colleagues recognize as being the high quality outlets in your field, and you want to make sure that you're publishing your work in journals that they will recognize so that you will continue to have a job and be promoted and be successful in your field. And so depending on where you are, what kind of department you're in, what kind of university you're in, even what country your university is in, there's going to be different standards for what they view as the appropriate places for you to publish. And so you'll want to talk to your colleagues and find out what their thoughts are on that to make sure that you're on track with their expectations as well.
Absolutely. And that actually raises a good point. Another common question we get is, what are the chances of publication without having a research institution in the background? And your chances of publication really depends on a variety of factors, such as the quality of the research, the relevance of the research, and the journal you're submitting to. While having a research affiliation, institutional affiliation, can certainly provide advantages, such as access to funding and resources, it's not necessarily a requirement for publication. In fact, there are many successful independent researchers who have been able to publish their work in reputable journals. So it's going back to that quality, making sure that your research is of high quality and addresses an important research question or gap in the field, and then thinking about those guidelines, the ethical guidelines, and if you don't have an institutional review board, looking at the Equator Network and making sure that you're meeting general ethical requirements. The author submission guidelines to the journals you're interested in submitting to will be a great resource there. And then also thinking about the formatting requirements. But again, thinking about your peers, your colleagues, and people that you meet while networking. So while it might have some challenges of not having an institutional affiliation or background, it is certainly not a barrier to publication, and just focusing on the quality and relevance of your research and relationships, building those relationships with others in your field will help you succeed as an independent researcher. All right. So going forward, we talked about what happens if someone does not meet all authorship criteria. So if they do not count as an author, then they should be listed in the acknowledgements. If someone has participated solely in acquisition of funding, the collection of data, or general supervision of the research group, they just one of those things, or even two, they do not necessarily meet the criteria for authorship. and they should be listed in the acknowledgement section. So any of these type of items. But if they've met if they've listed all 4 of those criteria to meet authorship, of course, acknowledge them as an author. But it's important to acknowledge people that have helped with some of these things, helping with the funding, collecting data, maybe providing technical editing, or reviewed your manuscript for you. So it's important to acknowledge them and thank them for their work in the acknowledgement sections. So those contributions that do not justify authorship may be acknowledged individually or together as a group under a single heading. So for instance, clinical investigators, participating investigators. This is following the ICMJE requirements. So you can list things like served as scientific advisors, critically reviewed the study proposal, collected data, provided care for study patients, participated in the writing or technical editing of the manuscript. So there's a variety of ways that you can list these contributions in the acknowledgement section of the manuscript. Over to you, Michael.
Okay, sure. So a little bit about author order and roles. And let me kind of start off by saying that some of this is different across disciplines and also is different depending on where you're located. In some countries outside the US, the first author, for example, is a different role in some ways than it is for most institutions inside the US. But typically the first or the lead author is the primary author, is the one who was responsible for carrying out the research or overseeing that it be carried out, often by their students or sometimes by teams of them and their colleagues. And they also take the primary responsibility for writing and editing the paper. On the other hand, the last author sometimes may be the more senior person or the most senior person, also may be the one who oversaw the project, may also be a funder on the project. And again, depending on what discipline you're in, I think in some disciplines, the funder is always included as an author, even when they maybe weren't as directly involved, whereas in other fields, it's more typical that the funder also would have to be involved in the data collection and writing and so forth to be recognized in this way. And so again, that's where the field that you're in and its norms determine how you would proceed. But then there's also the corresponding author, who's the one who takes on the role of communicating with the journal staff, who signs the contributor agreement with the journal. And that's often the first author, but it doesn't always have to be. It can be the first author. It can be any of the authors, really can be corresponding author, but that's the person who is responsible for making sure that the manuscript and all its attachments and different pieces are submitted in the proper order and with the proper file designations to the submission system. So for example, for SAGE, the Manuscript Central System has lots of different steps that you go through, that different places you have to check things. At one point, you have to put in the IRB approval number, for example, if your study is subject to IRB. There may be other parts about availability of data statements, about other aspects of open science, about pre-registration. And then also the contributor agreement saying that all the authors agree that they should be listed in the way that, in the order that they are being listed, that they all agree that they should be authors on this paper, and that they've all agreed with each other that this is the way you're submitting it is the way that it should appear in print. And so it's kind of a complicated process to be the corresponding author, but it's also a very important one to ensure that things go through smoothly and don't get held up by technical errors or omissions in the process. Let's see, am I leaving anything else off here? So again, I think just to reiterate again that the authorship order depends in part on where you are and on the norms that your field expects. So for like, for example, in my own work, sometimes I'll say, okay, I'm the lead author because I've done a lot of work and mostly written this paper. And other projects, I may have someone else, like one of my doctoral students, for example, who I want to be the first author because they've done most of the work. And so I'll say, okay, put me then as last author because I'm already a full professor. I don't need to be lead author anymore in order to be promoted because there's no more promotion levels past full professor at my institution. That's kind of where you get to, and then you're the senior person. Uh, you know, so it depends really on the individual project, but it's a good, important thing to have this discussion about author order and roles up front, really as early in the research process as you can, because there's always opportunities for misunderstandings or hurt feelings if people don't feel included or don't feel like they are in the authorship order where they wanted to be in the order. So you really want to try to iron that out up front. And it's not to say that it's permanent once you've had that conversation. It may change, for example, somebody may get busy with another obligation and they say, can I back off and let this other person who was maybe farther down on the list take more of a role in the writing and data analysis? And then that person may move up in the authorship order and the first one move down. So you can certainly change it along the way, but once you've gone and submitted to the journal, it pretty much, that's the order that you're going to be listed in the publication, and you really don't want to have to make any changes after that point. So you really want to have it worked out ahead of time so that you don't have any issues or any disputes later on in the publication process. One of the ways that's really handy for keeping track of who's who is an ORCID ID. And many journals, many of the SAGE ones now, I think especially recently, have started to require that at least the lead author or the corresponding author has to have an ORCID ID upon submission. And what this does is it clearly links you to a unique number. And that unique number then stays with you throughout your career, even if you change your name or you change your affiliation, or you decide you're going to start adding a middle initial now, or you have your name changed for various other reasons. Any of those changes, your ORCID ID stays the same number. And it really provides a helpful way to be able to track contributions across your entire career versus before these existed, somebody might say get married or get divorced and change their name as a result of it, and then you're not sure, is this really the same person who wrote this other work or not? And so these numbers have made it much easier to tell sort of what's going on. Another related place that isn't quite the same thing, but Google Scholar also, I think, uses your name as well as maybe these ID numbers and some other things to track you and to be able to put together a profile of you and your research if you ask it to set that up for you. And either way, these contributions are helpful because then once your article is published and has this ORCID ID number linked on it, then the ORCID ID page is able to say, okay, here's another thing this person published, let's add it to their record. And it again provides better record keeping across time and changes to name or affiliation. So it's a good development. And then a little bit more about collaboration, and collaboration is increasingly becoming what most people do in the research enterprise because research has gotten more complicated, funding has gotten more complicated and more difficult to obtain. And people have not only different expertise that they bring to the table, but also different people have different things that they enjoy doing. And in my experience, the collaboration is most successful when everybody gets to work on the part of a manuscript or of a research project that's the part that they enjoy doing. It's not to say you won't have to sometimes do parts you don't enjoy, but there's parts that you may like to do better, and there's parts that you may like other people to do rather than have to do it yourself. And so finding and putting together a collaborative team is important for productivity and for helping everybody better enjoy the work that they're doing. It also adds value and adds credibility. So for example, if I have a research question I want to investigate that I know is going to involve some heavy statistical analysis, then typically I partner with a statistician friend of mine to work and collaborate together, because they do the statistics every single day and they're really good at it. They do it quickly, they do it well, they know all the nuances. Whereas I know how to understand the results of what they've done, but if I had to be the one putting it into the computer and making the computer do the analysis, there's a good chance I would make an error because I'm not up to date on it, or it would just take me 3 or 4 times as long to do it as it would one of them who does that work every day. Support's another important one. It also really helps if you're writing collaboratively. You can set deadlines with each other. You can promise your friend or your colleague, hey, I'll have this draft done in 2 weeks. And that way you have to put it on your calendar and you really have to be done with it in 2 weeks because you promised them you would. And you want to always try to keep your word if you want to be someone that people want to collaborate with in the future. That's really important. And so by sort of pushing each other, you can get projects done more quickly and generally with a better overall quality as well, because multiple sets of eyes have looked at it. You can also bring in people that have specific experience, whether it's somebody who's more senior and has done this kind of work before, or whether it's somebody who has experience in a different aspect of the work. Or even if you're doing something like, say, you're doing qualitative coding of a data set, you always want to have multiple coders looking at the same data set to have some inter-rater reliability, for example. And so you can bring in someone who has experience in that area to work with you, and you can both code it, and that way you can report an inter-rater reliability coefficient, and it strengthens the work overall. And then also it helps you build relationships with other people in your field, and that's really important, not only for your own professional advancement, but also just because it makes it a lot more fun if you can go to conferences and be talking to people who you already have a relationship with, and you can also find out what are they working on, what else are they working on, what else do they know that other people are working on, and you can continue to build those collaborative partnerships. I find going to conferences in person is one of the best ways to build those relationships. You have to go, you have to talk to people in person, face to face, whether it's at social events, at a reception, after their talk, whenever it is that you get to talk to people, even if you accidentally run into them in the elevator in the hotel. And that's a great opportunity to talk to them quickly and find out what they're working on and find out if they're interested in collaborating with you on something. So all of these things are really important, and collaboration lets you take advantage of many different people's strengths, and everybody benefits from getting additional work done and getting additional publications written up and sent out.
Great, thank you. With all of this collaboration, what happens when there's conflict or misunderstanding? Sometimes co-authors can disagree on fundamental aspects of the article. And if this happens, the direction of your article can sometimes be confused, and that can cause publication delays. So as Michael mentioned, to limit the risk of this happening, we want to make sure all authors have a clear understanding and expectation of the article and their role from the beginning. So make sure to think of all the different possible scenarios for writing, editing, publishing, and make sure that everyone is happy and clear about the one that you settle on. So outline those roles and expectations even before starting the research. And like Michael mentioned, that might change throughout the process. Maybe someone takes on a new project and you have to adjust that slightly, but you want to make sure that you have clear communication about the authorship order at the beginning, and then you might need to change that as that process goes on. One of the reasons for this is to help maintain that consistent tone and voice. So throughout the writing, when different people contribute to a process, sometimes the tone and the voice of the article can be inconsistent. So again, making sure that everyone is clear and aligned on the purpose, the style, the expectation of the article. And as more people provide eyes on it and go through and write and edit, you can maintain that consistent voice throughout. as you're collaborating, maybe some people you know very well and you've worked with previously, maybe it's a new relationship, a new collaboration. You want to ensure that all authors are embracing that academic integrity in their current and their past work. So thinking about what are the previous studies that they've conducted and have different guidelines been followed, whether that's the Institutional Review Board guidelines that's been outlined or the Equator Network, another checklist that might be relevant in your discipline. So upholding the highest standards of academic integrity for yourself and for your coworkers. What happens, thinking about if there's possible plagiarism or something otherwise that compromises the article's integrity, you want to make sure that you trust your co-authors and have that foundation laid out before you collaborate. And if there is a possible concern, you can work with your institution, your organization. Oftentimes there's mediators that can help resolve authorship disputes, possible ethical concerns that may come up. And then related to that, once you're ready to submit, so you've created these relationships, you've put together these collaborations, you trust each other, you've outlined expectations, you've had clear deadlines, you have guidelines that you're following from start to finish. And only then, once everything has been outlined, compiled, completed, you'll need consent from all contributing authors before you even go ahead and submit your work. So again, looking at that fourth component of authorship, that each author has that personal stake in the matter and can take public responsibility for that work. So that consent needs to be granted by all contributing authors, and the corresponding author is often the one that's coordinating that communication. So this not only applies to that initial submission, but to all revised submissions as well, because you'll get feedback from editors and peer reviewers on how a manuscript might need to be changed, maybe a minor, maybe a major revision, and you'll want to make sure that you have that consent from all authors as well before you submit a revision. And then related to that, we get a lot of questions around someone that might not be an author, and submitting authors should be checking to make sure that anyone who has helped in any capacity is listed in that acknowledgement section. So making sure that you've properly thanked people that do need to be acknowledged. Back over to you, Michael.
Okay, well, yeah, this follows nicely on what you just said of the importance of etiquette and being respectful for all the authors and the people that you're referring to in the work, as well as people who were participants in your work. And it's important to not put anything in print that you wouldn't. It's sort of a golden rule thing. Don't put anything in print about someone that's damaging or hurtful to somebody else. That, if you wouldn't want whatever it is said about you, you probably shouldn't be saying it about someone else, right? And of course, also protecting personal information of your participants. That's generally covered in the IRB approval process, because you're required to conceal who those people are as a part of human subjects protections. I think there was a mention earlier on of what if you're an independent researcher and you don't have an IRB, and I believe you can actually go to an IRB that's in your community or in your area and request that they review your proposal as an independent scholar, and there's a process in place. I don't know the details of it, but I believe there is a process in place. And again, IRB is Institutional Review Board. It's specific in US rules, but many other countries have a similar process for pre-approving research to make sure that human subjects or participants in the research are protected in various ways. And again, one of those most important of those protections is not revealing personal information about people. Also, etiquette's important in following the instructions to authors, returning revisions and page proof requests to the publisher on time, and addressing queries. And addressing queries includes responding in some way to the reviewer's comments, because again, often your manuscript may go through 2, 3, 4 rounds of review where it gets sent back to one or more of the original reviewers. And they get the chance to say, have you or have you not addressed the things that they thought needed to be addressed in your manuscript? And so you want to be as polite as you can in responding to those. And sometimes you'll get, you know, the sort of joke is that it's always reviewer number 2 is the one who's really mean to you in their comments. But even reviewer 2, you want to be as polite as you can in responding back to them, because typically in a master review process, you don't know who they are, but they will know who you are once your work is published. And you don't want to upset people needlessly if you don't have to. And of course, if they've said something unreasonable, you can politely disagree. That's one of the other things I tell people as a journal editor, is that you don't have to do 100% of the things that the reviewers suggested. And in fact, sometimes one reviewer says one thing and another reviewer tells you to do the opposite thing. And if that's the case, then the editor ideally should have said which of those 2 conflicting things should you do in your manuscript to revise it. And if the editor hasn't said, then you can write back to the editor and say, hey, this reviewer said do this, but this one said do the opposite. Which one do you think I should do? Or you can suggest, hey, I got these 2 conflicting situations, and here's what I think I should do. And does this seem to you like it would be a reasonable way to respond? But again, if you're going to not do something that a reviewer's asked, you have to politely explain why you chose not to do that thing in your response when you send your revision back in. And that's an important place to be on your most polite behavior and so forth, because that reviewer is then going to recommend to the editor, based on their read of your revisions, whether or not they think your paper should be published. So again, you don't have to do 100% of what they say. Usually you should do most of what they suggest, because it's usually thoughtful and well-intentioned. But you want to explain in either case, yes, here's the things I did that you suggested. Thank you for suggesting these wonderful things. And oh, this paper is wonderful now that we've done all these things you suggested, right? You don't have to be quite that polite, but you know what I mean? You want to be polite. And if you didn't want to do something they said, explain politely why you didn't do that thing that they suggested. And that'll go a long way towards smoothing your process of making your revisions. Because almost every paper, I think in the 5 years of co-editing the journal I most recently co-edited, we had 1 paper during that time period that was accepted after the first round with no further revisions. And that was out of hundreds of papers that we reviewed. Only one of them the reviewers liked well enough to not suggest any changes. And so that's very, very rare. Don't expect that that's going to ever happen. If it ever happens to you, you're lucky, and it may never happen again. But you generally will get a lot of suggestions, especially on that first round of review. And your goal, if they ask you to make revisions and resubmit, that's the decision you want to get from the journal, as opposed to their other option, which is reject. No, this paper is not going to be good for us. You need to take it somewhere else.
Great, thank you. We've covered a lot of these elements today here, so we'll breeze through, but just wanted to cover a few basics of ethics and responsibility. So be sure to only submit to 1 journal at a time. This is best practice in academia. So when you're thinking about a journal to submit to, and you have 5 on your list, you only pick 1. Focus on that, and then if it's accepted, moves forward, or revisions, and if it's rejected, then you can go on to the next one into your list. You'll want to make sure that the work is original and written by you or the author team, that you'll be asked this to every journal that you submit to. And that's one of the criterias of authorship. So you want to make sure it's original and written by you. You also want to make sure that it has not been previously published. So preprints Most journals will allow you to submit to a preprint server or accept work that has been posted on a preprint server, but you'll also want to disclose this. So provide a link to the preprint, and whether the posting occurs prior to submission or during the peer review process, you want to disclose that, because duplicate publication is likely to result in a retraction. You want to make sure that you're adhering to best practices. So we get a lot of questions around conference presentations and poster presentations. We have a great page and resource on author reuse. So for instance, your dissertation, you can use published work in your dissertation or thesis. You can, if it's been presented as a poster that does not necessarily constitute prior publication, but again, it's that disclosure, the transparency. We have a whole webinar coming up here later in the year on reuse, and we've covered some of this in the past. You'll also want to make sure to observe copyrights and obtain necessary permissions. So when you're going and submitting your work and you have reused potential tables or figures from other papers, maybe from an author and their previous work, or someone else's, you'll want to make sure you're getting the necessary permissions that are required. Again, we could spend a whole webinar just on that. You want to make sure that you're clearly disclosing any conflicts of interest, any funding, adhering to all those research ethics we've been talking about, especially when human participants or animal studies are involved. And then being transparent in everything that you do. It's better to be transparent and have that sent up front rather than discovered later. Because if you, as an author, you have an obligation to correct mistakes once a significant error or inaccuracy is discovered in a published author. So in that instance, you would contact the journal and explain in what sense the error is impacting the article, and then the decision of how to correct that will depend on the nature of the error. So that could be a correction, like a corrigendum or a erratum. It could also be a retraction. But you as an author have that responsibility to report anything that may have come up either during submission or following publication. And then making sure that you have all the necessary permissions, so whether that's data sets, images, tables, figures, or what have you. For sake of time, I want to leave time for questions here at the end. So I'm going to pass this over to you, Adia, to talk about authorship disputes and how to resolve that.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on disputes. I think we've had a few questions in the chat already about what to do when there is an author left off the byline or if somebody's added. So I think I should acknowledge that it's a very common problem, and I should also acknowledge that these things are very difficult to mediate and resolve. Lots of people think that journal editors and publishers can resolve authorship disputes. It's not quite true. We rely on authors to mediate the disputes within themselves. And of course, if they need to, they should really involve the institution as much as possible, because the institution is there to kind of confirm who did what, who contributed to the research, who should be on the authorship byline. And they're really there to kind of uphold the principles of authorship and integrity. And they can contact the journal editor and publisher if they have any concerns. It's really important if you have come across an issue on something you submitted, or if you were left off a byline and that you happen to find out, you should really alert the journal editor before action is taken, just so that we can hold the submission as a journal editor or a publisher to make sure that any disputes are resolved prior to publication. It's not always easy, but it's easier than post-publication, which I'll talk about in a minute. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so post-publication disputes are probably even more common than pre-publication disputes. It needs to be acknowledged that I think around a third or 2/3 of our ethics cases that we see tend to be authorship cases. And I'm disappointed to say that often the resolution isn't satisfactory to all parties because it is a dispute, and sometimes there is a disagreement that cannot be resolved, and it's not always an ideal situation to be in. So we really recommend that the authorship decisions are made as early as possible. I think both Jessica and Michael have mentioned this. When you're planning your research, please consult the various journal guidelines, consult your institutional guidelines to see who should be an author, who shouldn't be an author, where should they be placed. There are some research area specific guidelines as well, who should be first author, who should be last. Journal editors can help you if you have questions, but it's really important that this is decided in advance, because if this comes to light after publication, there's very little we can do. We can contact the institution and ask them to investigate, but often the institution doesn't have enough evidence to ask an author to be added to a byline. Or actually, they might have a policy that says your supervisor should be on an author byline, even if it doesn't mean that, even if it means that they didn't agree with what you were kind of saying at the start. So it can be really complicated to investigate these things. They're very time consuming. And as I've already mentioned, if somebody's been left off unfairly, we don't always have the evidence to kind of add them to an author byline after publication. So it's really something that should be decided at the start of your research project so that you don't have problems later on. We go to the next slide. So just a quick segue into our name change policy. SAGE have a formal policy where we allow changes to names post-publication and pronouns for any reason. So as we've listed here, there's a lot of reasons for name changes like marriage, divorce, gender affirmation, or religious conversion. We don't ask for reasons. If somebody comes to us and asks us to change the name on their publication, we facilitate that change. And we also do not publish a correction notice so that we protect the privacy of our authors, and we make this a completely silent change. And we make sure that any further indexing databases also carry this name change, so you don't have to contact thousands of people. So yeah, that's our name change policy.
Thank you. Also wanted to briefly cover what to do if an author has passed away. We get these questions somewhat regularly. So if a co-author died after the manuscript was submitted and before it was accepted, there is a modified contributor form for use where one of the co-authors has died. Because the author was alive when it was submitted, we have this implied consent of publication through the co-author's participation and awareness of the submission. But if the co-author died before the manuscript was submitted, the co-authors will look to the heirs or family to agree to the publication, and we ask that you have documentation that illustrates the role of each author in preparing the manuscript, because that documentation will be helpful to provide consent of the deceased author's intent to publish that article. So just wanted to briefly cover that. Just a quick plug on the upcoming webinars. Next month, we'll be talking about image integrity and the best way to present information, but also if you're doing any editing or we want to make sure you're doing that in an ethical way. And then we have a variety of webinars coming up in the rest of 2023. You've seen this before. Be sure to refer to our SAGE Journals resources with a variety of information and resources on how to get published and answering these common questions that we receive on a regular basis. So without further ado, Maria, over to you to facilitate the last few minutes for questions here. I see quite a few coming in.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to our panelists for this really useful and helpful presentation. I can see that we've got a lot of questions, and I know we answered quite a few of them during the presentation. So we're going to try and get as many done as possible. But as I said, we will follow up with you after the webinar if we can't answer your question today. So I think there were a number of questions about the author order, which I know you have addressed during the presentation, but I had a quick question here about if there is some pattern of keeping corresponding author in the beginning or at the end, and can corresponding authors be placed in between? I don't know who would like to tackle that question, but I'll leave it up to you.
I can, sure. Yeah, that really it can be any author anywhere in the list, particularly, if you're working with graduate students and you want one of them to have the experience of being a corresponding author so they know what's involved. They may be a middle author in the paper somewhere, but may take on that role under supervision to learn how the process works and to gain more experience with it. But typically it's usually either the first or sometimes the last author, but there's no rule that says it has to be.
Thank you, Michael. We had a question here also about co-first authors, and if they were wondering if the panelists could explain a little bit about co-first authors.
To say something, I think it's very common in collaborative projects where you can have two, perhaps PhD students who contributed equally, and they really would appreciate being co-first authors. I think that's very normal. I've also seen publications where there are 4 joint first authors, so it's becoming increasingly common in large-scale studies, large-scale collaborations. So we certainly don't have a problem with it at Sage. We can just highlight that with an asterisk in the final output and say that these authors contributed jointly. It's up to the authors how they wish to put that in their CV. If they want to put whoever's name first, that's completely up to them. We don't really have any problems with that.
The other thing I see on manuscripts that have a lot of authors is they'll maybe have one person who's the lead author and then list all the rest in alphabetical order with a note saying everybody contributed in these different ways, and we just put the names in alphabetical order.
Thank you for that. There was a question here about, well, I'll just read the question. I am sorry if this sounds redundant. So a student who is actually doing the lab work, i.e. collecting data, maybe analyzing it, maybe not. The one that actually did the main work should not be an author?
I can take this one as well. We get this question a lot. And I think it's really important to read the ICMGA guidelines in full, which actually, of course, they say that the person should have been involved in writing. They also have an addendum at the bottom that if someone did contribute to the research, collecting data or analyzing data, they should be given the opportunity to take part in writing and thus become an author. So I think if you have students who are doing work, please involve them in writing. I think it's a great experience for them. They should be authors as appropriate in your field of research. I think it's great experience for them, and they really should be part of the writing process as much as possible.
Thank you. I have a quick question here about ChatGPT. Should ChatGPT be acknowledged if it has been used?
I can take this one if you'd like. So yes, you'll want to clearly indicate the use of language models in the manuscript, so including which model is used and for what purpose. And then you might want to use the methods or acknowledgement section as appropriate. ChatGPT cannot be listed as an author, cannot be listed as an author. You'll also want to verify the accuracy, validity, and appropriateness of the content and any citations generated by language models, and correct any errors or inconsistencies. Provide a list of sources used to generate content and citations, including those generated by language models. So double checking those citations again to ensure they're accurate and properly referenced. Be conscious of the potential for plagiarism, where the a model may have reproduced substantial text from other sources. So be sure to check the original sources to be sure you're not plagiarizing someone else's work. We want to make sure everything is properly cited, properly referenced, and then acknowledge the limitations of language models in the manuscript, including the potential for bias, errors, and gaps in the knowledge. So acknowledging that, being transparent, including it maybe in the acknowledgement section, methods section, and then checking the guidelines of the journal as well that you're submitting to make sure there's any to see if there's any specific policies that may be in place. Some journals may not allow the use of ChatGPT. Adia, Michael, anything I may have missed there?
I have heard that it occasionally makes up references completely, so that would be really a key thing to check to make sure that all the references are actually legitimate, real sources, and not ones that it just made up to sound like a real source, which obviously would be really easy for a language model to do.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have run out of time, unfortunately, and I know we still have a lot of questions. So we will follow up with you, as we said, on your questions, because there are some really good questions here, and this is a very complicated subject. So we appreciate your time today. And I just wanted to thank our panelists again for this really helpful presentation. I hope to see you all next month for our next webinar, and have a lovely day.